through various cultural revolutions, you know. Amongst these, of course, is the 68ers, and what emerged out of there was feminism and multiculturalism. Welcome to part two. Now, um, these forces have had even more of an effect than communism. Communism could be argued to be about a small vanguard elite since Lenin came along. Of course, Marx didn't believe in that, but Marx had his own views on that. He distorted the general type of socialism, which could be brought back to both Thomas Paine and the English unions before that, and the fight for workers' rights, which goes back to English nationalism. And of course, Thomas Paine is now seen in terms of modern politics as a libertarian, but of course he believed in a balance of liberty and equality under the rule of law within a constitution, and I would agree with Thomas Paine on most things. And of course, this came from the Epicurean viewpoint, which came back from the discovery of Lucretius's book on the nature of things, or the nature of matter, which was rediscovered during the Middle Ages and then became printed and affected Thomas Jefferson, who, with Thomas Paine, developed the American Constitution. So, the high watermark of Western power could have even been said to have been just in the post World War II era. Whatever National Socialists may believe about the Nuremberg trials, it is undoubtedly true that the attempt at a legal process to end the war was significant. Okay, although it may have been a show trial from certain perspectives, and of course, it's widely believed that the man who was Rudolf Hess in the jury was not Rudolf Hess. He was a mental patient, didn't recognise his son when he was brought to him, and also Albert Speer said there was no coherent conversation with Rudolf Hess, the person who's accused of being him, during the trial. And it may be, if you've read a book by Louis Kiltzer, who is an investigative journalist, you may have seen that Rudolf Hess was murdered during the war, that he attempted a peace mission to try and sue for terms during, or an armistice at least, a ceasefire between Britain and Germany after the Battle of Britain, which may have saved millions of people's lives both in the Soviet Union and in Western Europe, as the conditions for that would have been the withdrawal of the Germans. But this series is about the morality of counter-colonization. As I said before in the first vid, ultra-conservatives have brought in immigrants as cheap labour to exploit them and to exploit their own working and middle class to reduce the actual real level of wages, which has continued since the 1960s as immigrant populations have grown. In America, it was 90% of the people were of Nordic or Celtic descent, despite the fact that you had Italian, which was Roman immigration, and Greek immigration to America, where the people, for the most part, integrated well and contributed to American society. And of course, the slave trade, which was started by the Arabs and Jewish people in Africa, because of course the Jewish people came from the Horn of Africa, and that's why I would support them having a new state there, to bring in capital to East Africa and the Horn of Africa. But it's undeniable that the Arabs and the Jewish people had a significant effect on the slave trade in Africa, which of course then encouraged Europeans to take part in the trade during the Renaissance era and bring Africans to America. That constituted America's 10% of the population after the Second World War, and then as pro-multiculturalist ideas during the 1970s which coincided with Jewish people leaving the Soviet Union to go to America and Israel. It's steadily increased the level of population that is non-American within America, which has consistently changed and completely changed the Americans' identity of themselves. Before, the Americans, when they were homogeneous, believed themselves to be a constitutional people, and everyone who believed in the American Constitution was American, no matter what their race or ethnic or political origin or religious belief. But today, immigrant populations have come to a point where they do not necessarily have to integrate to gain all the means of life and the means to continue economic actions, because they have such a strong strong ability to generate more people who have their belief system and their values. And this is completely at odds with, as Thilo Sarrazin has said, who's a social democrat in Germany, who wrote a book on social democracy called Germany Does Away With Itself, and was also about immigration. It is not just people's race, but their values. If people do not believe in social democratic values, if they're ultra-Zionist or ultra-Islamic, or if they're from Africa, believe in voodoo, which you can check out in Benin and other places, is the state religion. If, on the other hand, there were Middle Eastern cults such as Freemasonry, ultra Christianity, ultra Judaism in Europe before, and those have as the policy of trying to integrate those people towards Western values, which come from the Epicureans and the Stoics, which were Roman values, and merge them with nationalism and social democracy, which are European values and European philosophies, has not completely worked, in Europe or America, So the level of integration will not be completely homogeneous. People's economic, political actions are not homogeneous as neoclassical economics, which comes from ultra-conservatism, said, and the belief that everyone is culturally the same from multiculturalism is, of course, either knowingly perverse or naive. And this came from the 1968ers. In fact, I'll show you how strong with an example the 1968ers movement was from feminism and multiculturalism. That a woman who was a famous newsreader in Germany very recently lost her job for being pregnant. Her baby is, if I'm correct to say this in terms of the media report that was given by CBS, was said that the child was a male, and so feminists accused her of continuing patriarchism. I know, absurd, because of course if their fathers hadn't had intercourse with their mothers, they would not have been born themselves. So it is, in a sense, a multiculturalism and feminism can lead to extinctionist cults within Western society, which I did a video on. These and the belief of multiculturalists that there is moral relativism between immigration and Western civilization, providing both cities, which were factories for creating more Western ideals and more Westernized people, whatever their race was, such as Hong Kong is an example of, or the various cities in Africa that were built, or India. Indian intellectuals now most of them say they think in English. It changes the whole way of thinking. So language is important.